The halls of Terra were built for creatures that fought in centuries. Every surface was crystalline, every corridor wide enough for beings 3 times the size of a man, and every light tuned to frequencies that made human eyes ache if they looked too long. Cho Tae-sung had learned not to look too long. 20 years of walking these halls had taught him that much. He adjusted his tie. Earth's best suit, tailored in Seoul, pressed that morning by hand because the ship's machine left creases in the wrong places. Tae-sung cared about creases. He cared about the angle of his collar, the shine on his shoes, the exact distance he walked behind the Velith escort. Close enough to seem cooperative, far enough to not seem eager. These were the measurements of a man who had turned patience into a profession. Yoon Nari walked beside him, and she cared about none of these things. She was 29, overeducated, underpaid, and currently translating the ambient chatter of 6 alien species in her head simultaneously. Most of them were talking about the weather on their home systems. 2 were discussing shipping routes. 1, a cluster of droomy diplomats, drifting past like a school of translucent jellyfish, was talking about humans. "They're saying we smell like iron," Nari murmured. "We do," Tae-sung said. "Hemoglobin. They're saying it's unpleasant." Noted. Moving on. The classification hall was at the center of Tiraneth, a vast spherical chamber where every species in the galactic concord had been formally designated since the system's creation. The walls held the records. Billions of entries carved into crystal by Velith artisans, each species reduced to a single line of text. Their biology, their function, their place. Tae-sung had read humanity's line 11 times over 11 years. He could recite it the way a prisoner recites the number on his cell. The chamber was full. Not for them. The Okar had a trade revision on the docket, and the Pelori had manifested, a rare event like seeing a comet, to oversee some procedural formality. Humanity's classification review was the last item, the smallest item, the kind of thing a bureaucracy schedules at the end of the day because nobody expects it to take long. Tae-sung stood at the central platform. Nari stood behind him with a datapad containing every argument they'd prepared. Humanity's scientific achievements, their art, their literature, their survival across ice ages, plagues, world wars, and the vacuum of space itself. It was a good case, well cited. He presented it for 43 minutes. He spoke clearly. He did not rush. He used the Concord's own metrics where he could, and introduced human ones where he couldn't. He talked about adaptation, how humans had colonized deserts, tundra, ocean floors, and the moons of Jupiter. How they modified their own bodies, their tools, their environments, and when none of that worked, they modified their expectations and kept going anyway. The Pelori representative did not interrupt. It hung in the air above the chamber like a slow-burning star, formless and ancient and patient in a way that made Tae-sung's patience look like a child counting to 10. When he finished, the chamber was quiet for 4 seconds. Then the Pelori spoke. Its voice came from everywhere, the way thunder does. It reread the original designation. Class 9, Endurance Fauna. Noted for high pain tolerance, environmental adaptability, irrational persistence under terminal conditions, recommended use, manual labor, hazardous environment work, biological stress testing. The same words, the same line, unchanged for 31 years. Tae-sung thanked the council. He collected his datapad. He walked out. Nari caught up with him in the corridor, her diplomatic smile gone, replaced by something that looked like it could cut glass. She wanted to know why he hadn't argued, why he hadn't pushed back, why he'd spent 43 minutes building a case and then accepted a 2-sentence dismissal like it was a weather report. Tae-sung kept walking. His shoes clicked on the crystal floor, and the sound was the only thing in the corridor that belonged to Earth. "They don't need to respect us, Nari," he said. "They need to need us. That hasn't happened yet." She opened her mouth. closed it, followed him in silence. 600 light-years away, on a Velith-operated asteroid mining station called Outpost Galan, Kwon Do-hyun was pulling a dead man out of a decompressed corridor. The man's name was Park Woo-jin. He was 26. He'd transferred to Galan 3 months ago because the pay was better than the orbital platforms near Mars, and he was sending money home to his mother in Busan. He played cards badly, laughed too loud, and always volunteered for the worst shifts, because he said it made the good ones feel better. The pressure seal on Corridor 9 had failed. It was a known fault. Do-hyun had filed 4 reports about it. 4 reports, 4 responses, all identical. Maintenance request logged. Priority low. Class 9 labor zones are rated for intermittent pressure variance. Rated for it. The corridor was rated for it. The workers inside it, apparently, were also rated for it. Do-hyun carried Woo-jin to the medical bay. The Velith medic scanned the body the way a mechanic scans a broken drill, looking for what went wrong so it could be accounted for in the equipment loss column. When the report came through on Do-hyun's datapad an hour later, it read, "Livestock attrition within acceptable parameters." He read it once, twice, 3 times. Livestock attrition. Park Woo-jin, who laughed too loud and played cards badly, and sent money to Busan, was livestock attrition. Do-hyun put the datapad down on the table, face down, like it was something that could look back at him. He sat in the quarters he shared with 3 other men, on a bunk made for a species that didn't need mattresses, in a station where the air recyclers were calibrated for Velith lungs, and left humans with a permanent low-grade headache. Tight, enough that his knuckles went white, and his nails dug crescents into his palms, and the small, sharp pain of it was a familiar thing, an old friend, a rope he could hold when everything else was sliding. That's a problem for later. He said it to no one. The room didn't answer. Galan kept spinning, and somewhere in a crystal hall, 600 light-years away, the word livestock sat carved in a wall, and no one who could change it thought it was wrong. The first readings came from a deep space sensor array on the edge of Concord territory, a ripple in the dark energy field, spreading outward like a crack in frozen glass. The OCAR mathematicians ran the numbers in their liquid tanks, and came back with projections that nobody wanted to believe. Something was moving through space, and it was rewriting the rules of physics as it went. They called it the Black Wave. It was not a weapon. It was not alive. It was a rolling wall of destabilized energy that turned stable systems into chaos, atmospheres inverting, gravity folding in on itself, temperatures swinging by hundreds of degrees in the space between one breath and the next. Sensors near the wavefront recorded readings that contradicted each other. A zone could be boiling and freezing at the same time. The OCAR said this was mathematically possible. The Velith said this was architecturally unacceptable. The Drumi said nothing because 3 of their forward outposts had already gone silent. The Concord called an emergency session. Every species sent delegates. The chamber on Tiraneth buzzed with 1,000 conversations in 100 languages, and underneath all of them ran a single frequency that even the Drumi's empathic networks couldn't filter out. Fear. The Velith couldn't survive thermal instability. Their silicon-based biology cracked under rapid temperature shifts, the way glass cracks under boiling water. The Drumi's empathic network, which connected thousands of individuals into a shared emotional field, turned collective fear into a biological cascade. One panicking Drumi could put an entire city into cardiac arrest. The OCAR required stable liquid environments to think, and the Black Wave turned liquids into weapons. Even the Pelori, ancient and untouchable, simply withdraw. They had survived this long by refusing to engage with physical reality. This was no different. Every superior species in the galaxy had a weakness the Black Wave could exploit. Every one. Baek Ji-sok sat in the tactical room of Earth's liaison vessel, the Sejong, parked in Terranet's docking ring. He watched the projections scroll across his screen, and ran them again and again. He was a man who trusted patterns the way other people trusted promises, and the pattern here was clean. 90 days. That's what the Black Wave needed to reach the Concorde's 3 largest population centers. Evacuation was possible for some, not most. The Concorde's stations, cities, and orbital platforms were Velith built, designed for stability, optimized for predictable environments, and catastrophically fragile when those environments stopped being predictable. Ji-sok filed a tactical assessment with Earth's delegation. 14 pages, clear projections, possible endurance fauna, didn't do analysis. He filed it anyway. "We've been here before," he told his adjutant, a young officer named Shin Eunji, who was barely old enough to remember the belt conflicts. She asked where here was. He didn't answer. 3 days after the emergency session, a Droomy diplomat approached Cho Tae-sung in a service corridor on Terranet's lower ring. She was alone, which was unusual for a species that drew strength from proximity. Her skin, normally translucent and faintly luminous, had gone pale. Her hands moved in small, repetitive gestures that Nari would later identify as a self-soothing behavior, the Droomy equivalent of wringing one's hands. She did not identify herself. She did not make a formal request. She looked at Tae-sung and said, "Your species, the classification file says you adapt to anything. Is that true?" Tae-sung had spent 20 years in alien halls, smiling at beings who thought he was furniture. He had memorized every insult disguised as protocol, and returned each one with a courtesy so precise it could draw blood. He had never once dropped the mask. He dropped it now. "Which part of the file are you reading?" he said, not smiling, not angry, just looking at her with eyes that were, for the first time in a very long time, completely honest. The Droomy diplomat did not answer. She left the way she came, and her hands were still moving. 2 days later, Hwan Do-hyun received new orders. There was no briefing, no explanation. A Velith overseer entered the crew quarters at Outpost Gallon, and informed Do-hyun's mining team that they had been reassigned to Forward Station Kale, a research platform near the Black Wave's projected path. Transportation would depart in 6 hours. Personal belongings were limited to 1 container per unit. Per unit. Not per person, per unit. 14 men and women who had spent the last year pulling ore out of an asteroid for a species that classified their injuries as equipment loss. They were tired, underfed. Their gear was mining standard, not rated for anything close to what the Black Wave projections described. He asked the overseer why they were being sent. The Velith looked at him with an expression that wasn't contempt. It was the complete absence of the idea that contempt was even necessary. "You are rated for hazardous environments," it said. "Rated," Do-hyun repeated. The words sat in his mouth like a stone. 600 light-years away, Yoon Nari was doing what she did best, listening to conversations she was not supposed to hear. The Concorde's communication networks were encrypted, but the encryption was designed to keep out species with advanced computational abilities. It was not designed to keep out a woman who spoke 11 languages and understood that the most important information was never in the data. It was in the gaps between the data. She found the deployment orders in a logistics queue buried 3 layers deep in the Velith infrastructure management system. Human labor teams from 12 outposts were being reassigned to forward positions near the Black Wave's path. No consultation with Earth's delegation. No notification. No consent. The Concorde wasn't asking humanity for help. They were moving equipment. Nari brought the intelligence to Tae-sung. He read it on her datapad, standing in his quarters, his suit jacket hung on the back of a chair, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was the closest Tae-sung ever came to looking like a man under pressure. He read it again. "They need us now," Nari said. Taesung folded the datapad closed, placed it on the desk, aligned it with the edge. Because even now, even here, the angles mattered. "Of course," he said, "as you say." But his eyes had changed. Something behind them had shifted, from the long patience of a man waiting for his moment, to the focused stillness of a man who knew it had arrived. He sat down, opened a blank document, and began to draft terms. Not a request, not a petition. Terms. Because Cho Taesung had spent 20 years learning exactly how this galaxy worked. And he knew one thing, that every crystal wall and classification record and Pelori decree had tried to make him forget. You don't negotiate from need. You negotiate from necessity. And for the first time in human history, the galaxy didn't just need hands. It needed human ones. The first human team entered the Black Wave on a Tuesday. Not that days meant anything out here, but Han Soyi kept a calendar on her wrist, an old digital watch her father had given her before she left Earth, the kind that couldn't connect to anything, and told time in Seoul, regardless of what star system she was standing in. It said Tuesday. So it was Tuesday. She stood in the airlock of Forward Station Kale, with 13 other humans, wearing environmental suits that the Velith had provided 6 hours ago. The suits were designed for Velith engineers, tall, rigid, calibrated for silicon biology. The human teams had spent those 6 hours gutting and rewiring them with zip ties, medical tape, and a soldering iron that Do-hyun had stolen from a maintenance closet. The suits worked. Barely. They worked the way a car with 3 wheels works. It moves, but every second is a negotiation with disaster. Kwon Do-hyun stood at the front. He checked every suit seal personally, one by one, the way he used to check the rigs in the mines. His hands moved with mechanical precision, pressing, twisting, testing. When he reached Soyi, he paused. "Helmet's loose," he said. "I know. The neck joint doesn't fit human heads. Fix it. I used all the tape." He pulled a strip of adhesive from his own suit's chest panel, leaving a gap in his own seal the size of a coin, and handed it to her. "Do-hyun, fix it." She fixed it. They entered the zone. The Black Wave didn't look like anything. That was the worst part. From outside, it was a shimmer, like heat haze over a road. From inside, the universe stopped making promises. Gravity tilted 15 degrees to the left without warning, and the whole team staggered like drunks on a ship's deck. The temperature in Soyi's suit dropped 40 degrees in 2 seconds, then spiked 60 in 3. Her visor fogged, cleared, fogged again. The air recyclers screamed a pitch that meant it was working harder than it was built to work, and she tried not to think about what happened when it stopped. Their mission was simple, in the way that jumping out of a burning building is simple. A Drumi residential station, home to 6,000 civilians, was caught in the Black Wave's outer edge. The Drumi couldn't evacuate themselves. Their empathic network had turned collective fear into a biological weapon against their own bodies. Half the population was unconscious, the other half was dying of someone else's panic. Do-hyun's team had to get in, stabilize the evacuation corridors, and guide the conscious Drumi to the shuttle bay. The Velith had attempted the same operation 4 hours earlier. Their team lasted 14 minutes before thermal shock cracked 3 of their engineers like porcelain, and the rest retreated. The Velith record. Do-hyun's team worked for 9 hours. They didn't work gracefully. There was no elegance in it. Soyi watched a man named Kang Ji-hwan vomit inside his helmet when the gravity flipped completely upside down, then swallow it and keep walking, because there was no alternative that didn't involve dying. She watched a woman named Oh Mi-rae carry 2 unconscious Drumi across a corridor where the floor had become the ceiling. Her boots magnetized to a surface that kept changing its mind about which direction was down. Mireille's arms shook the entire time. She didn't put them down. A Velith engineering team watched from the safe zone outside. They had been assigned to make structural repairs once conditions stabilized. Conditions did not stabilize. They watched the human team work through an environment that their own biological models said should be lethal after 20 minutes. One of the Velith engineers approached the communication channel. Its voice came through flat and precise, the way Velith voices always did. "How are you functioning in there?" it asked. Do-hyun was carrying a Droomy elder on his back at the time, walking through a corridor where the walls were sweating something that might have been condensation, or might have been the station's structural fluid leaking. He didn't look up. "We're rated for it," he said. "Remember?" The Velith didn't respond. Soyi found the child in a maintenance shaft on Deck 7. A Droomy child, small and almost fully transparent, separated from its cluster. The child's empathic distress signal was broadcasting at a frequency that Soyi's suit instruments registered as biologically active, meaning it wasn't just a signal, it was a physical force. She felt it hit her like a wall of cold water. Her heartbeat doubled. Her hands went numb. The child was terrified, and its terror was contagious in the most literal sense. It broadcast fear directly into the nervous systems of any biological creature within range. Soyi picked it up. She picked it up the way you pick up a cat in a thunderstorm, firm and close and unapologetic, and she started walking. 2 kilometers. Through a gravity-loss corridor where the floor disappeared, and she had to pull herself hand over hand along the ceiling rails with a Droomy child pressed against her chest, broadcasting pure fear into her brainstem the entire time. "Okay, okay, okay," she said, over and over. A mantra that was not for the child, it was for the part of her brain that wanted to let go. She did not let go. When she reached the shuttle bay, the Droomy cluster was there. One of them touched Soyi's hand, a gesture that, she would later learn, was the Droomy equivalent of a debt that could never be spoken aloud. Soyi didn't know that then. She just knew something warm passed through her glove and into her fingers, and it almost made her cry. She didn't cry. There were more decks to clear. 600 light-years away, on the Sejong, Baek Jisok was watching the black wave move. He had been watching it for 72 hours straight, mapping its trajectory across every sensor feed the Concorde made available, which was most of them, because the Concorde had bigger problems than worrying about what an endurance fauna strategist might find in their data. He found something. The black wave was not random. It was not a natural cascade. It moved with a pattern, expanding in some directions, contracting in others, converging. Slowly, over weeks and months, but converging toward a single point. Terra. Jisok filed the observation with the Concorde's Strategic Command. A Velith logistics officer reviewed it and returned a note. Observation logged. Source: Class 9 Labor Liaison. Priority: low. Jisok read the note, closed the screen, opened a new file, and began running deeper analysis. Because Baek Jisok did not trust institutions, he trusted patterns, and the pattern said something was coming for the capital of the galaxy, and nobody was listening to the only person who saw it. Back in the Black Wave Zone, Do-hun's team extracted after 18 hours. They came out broken. 2 people on stretchers, 3 with chemical burns on their arms, where the suit seals had failed. 1 man, Yun Sung-ho, unconscious and breathing through a tube that Soy had built from spare parts and stubbornness. The Velith medical team scanned them at the station's entrance. Efficient, thorough, clinical. The report was generated automatically and sent to the Concorde's operational log within minutes. It read, Class 9 fauna performing within expected parameters. Soy saw it on the medical base screen while she was stitching a cut on her own forearm with one hand. because the other hand was holding a compress against Ji-hwan's cracked ribs, and there was nobody else available. She looked at the screen, looked at Sung-ho on the stretcher, still unconscious, still breathing through her improvised tube, looked at the words. Expected parameters. Expected parameters, she said out loud, to no one, to the room, to the station that didn't care, to the report that would sit in a file next to 1,000 other reports that described extraordinary things in the most ordinary language the galaxy had ever invented. Nobody laughed. There was nothing to laugh at. The joke was the system, and the system didn't know it was funny. Ji Seok was right. He hated that he was right. The black wave was converging on Tirraneth. Not drifting, not wandering, moving with the slow, patient certainty of a thing that had been pointed at a target a very long time ago and had never once lost its heading. The Okar confirmed his math within hours of finally looking at it. The Velith confirmed the structural projections within a day. Tirraneth, the jewel of the Concord, the station that held the government of 1,000 species, Tirraneth was sitting directly in the path of something that would turn its crystal halls into a blender. The Concord called another emergency session. This one was quieter than the last. Fear had moved past the loud stage and into the stage where people sit very still and breathe very carefully. He stood in the chamber where Taesung had argued for reclassification and been dismissed. And he laid out the data with the mechanical calm of a man who had long ago stopped caring whether anyone liked what he had to say. The black wave was not natural. It was a weapon, an ancient Pelori defense system from a war so old that even the Concord's records called it pre-archival. Something in deep space had reactivated it. A trigger, a signal, a timer that had finally reached zero. It didn't matter what. What mattered was that there was a stabilization array buried in Tirraneth's core, Pelori-built, older than most civilizations, and it could shut the black wave down. The catch was the catch that catches always are. The array required physical activation, manual, hands-on controls, inside the station's core, inside the black wave. The Pelori representative confirmed all of this with the reluctance of a species being asked to admit it had once built something capable of destroying everything it now governed. Yes, the array existed. Yes, it could work. No, they could not activate it themselves. They had abandoned physical forms centuries ago. They could no more touch the controls than a thought could grip a wrench. The chamber went quiet. Not silent. Quiet in the way a room full of people goes quiet, when every person in it is looking at the same door and trying to decide who walks through it. Every delegation looked at the human delegation. Cho Tae-sung sat in his chair. His suit was pressed, his hands were folded. His face carried the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment for exactly 20 years, and was not going to waste it by speaking first. The silence stretched. 15 seconds. 30. The Drumi shifted. The Okar rippled in their tanks. A full minute passed before a Velith council member finally said, "The human delegation may wish to comment on operational feasibility." Taesung let 3 more seconds pass. Then he spoke. "I believe you have a question for us." He didn't volunteer. He didn't offer. He didn't stand up and deliver a rousing speech about humanity's willingness to sacrifice. He sat in his chair, in his pressed suit, with his folded hands, and he made them ask. They asked, and then Taesung told them the price. Full reclassification. Not a review, a guarantee. Ratified before a single human entered the zone. Permanent seat on the Concord's governing council. Formal apology entered into the Concord's official record for 3 decades of Class 9 designation. Immediate termination of all livestock labor contracts across every Velith-operated facility in Concord space. The Pelori representative said this was unprecedented. Taesung didn't blink. "You built the weapon," he said. "We'll disarm it, but we will not do it as livestock." The ratification took 4 hours. It should have taken weeks. The Black Wave was 19 days out. Weeks were a luxury that geometry had revoked. Do-hyun got the call on the Sejong, where his crew had been transferred after the evacuation missions. So-yi was with him. Ji-seok delivered the briefing in person, standing in a room that smelled like recycled air and antiseptic, and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't wash off. The math was this. Black wave exposure at the array's depth gave a human team approximately 40 minutes before cellular breakdown became irreversible. Not death, irreversible damage. The body would keep working past that threshold, the way a car keeps driving after the engine warning light comes on. But what it was driving toward was a cliff. The activation sequence took 35 minutes, 5 minutes of margin. Ji-seok called it workable. His voice was steady when he said it, and So-yi respected him for that, because she could see in his eyes that he knew what workable meant when you were talking about human bodies in an environment that wanted to take them apart. Do-hyun looked at the numbers, looked at So-yi, looked at the 6 volunteers who had stepped forward from his crew without being asked, because they had been in the Black Wave once and survived, and apparently that made them the kind of people who thought doing it again was a reasonable decision. "That's a problem for later," Do-hyun said. They descended into Tiraneth's core on the day the Black Wave hit. The station shuddered around them like a living thing in pain. Crystal walls that had stood for millennia cracked and sang, and the sound was beautiful and terrible, a choir of breaking glass that echoed through corridors designed to carry sound forever. Gravity came in waves, pulling them left, then down, then in directions that didn't have names. The temperature in Do-hyun's suit swung so fast that the readout stopped trying to keep up and just displayed a blinking line. So-yi kept count, not out loud, in her head. She tracked heart rates, blood oxygen, cortisol estimates, radiation exposure, running a medical tally on every person in the team with the quiet precision of a woman who understood that information was the last thing she could control when everything else had gone feral. She knew. She knew before they reached the array. She knew the exact second that Kang Ji-won crossed from recoverable to permanent. She knew when Oh-mire's exposure tipped past the line where the damage stops being something you heal from and becomes something you carry. She didn't say it. She kept walking. The array was a cathedral of dead technology. Pelori architecture from an age when they still had bodies, still built with hands, still believed that physical things mattered. The controls were not buttons or screens. They were grooves in a surface that pulsed with residual energy, designed for beings that could interface with matter through thought and touch simultaneously. Humans could not do that. Humans had hands. Do-hyun put his hands on the controls. The surface burned, not metaphorically. The energy running through the array was hot enough to cook through the suit's gloves in seconds, and he felt his skin blister and split and fuse against the alien metal like wax against a stove. So-yi was beside him, her hands on a different panel, rerouting power through circuits that were never designed for physical manipulation, improvising connections between systems that hadn't been touched in 10,000 years. Her gloves melted. She kept going. That's what the math said. It took 37. The array activated with a sound that was less a sound and more a feeling, a deep bone-level hum that passed through every wall and floor and body in the station, and told the Black Wave, in a language older than speech, to stop. It stopped. Do-hyun's team extracted. 2 carried, 1 walking with a broken leg splinted by So-yi using a piece of Pelori crystal she'd snapped off a wall. Do-hyun walked on his own. His hands were destroyed, fused burns from fingertip to wrist, the skin gone in places, the tissue underneath cooked to a color that Soyi cataloged clinically and refused to think about emotionally. At the exit, a Velith medical team was waiting. They scanned the team. Efficient, fast, professional. Dohun stood in the airlock. The black wave was collapsing behind him, folding in on itself like a wave pulling back from shore. Tiraneth was shaking, but standing. The crystal walls were cracked but whole. He looked down at his hands. They were open. Burned, ruined, shaking so hard that the tremor was visible from across the room. Do-hyun's hands were healing. Mostly. So-yi sat on the edge of his bed in the Sejong's medical bay and told him the truth the way she always did, quickly, clearly, and without looking away. 3 fingers on the left hand would lose fine motor control. The nerve damage in his right palm was permanent. He'd grip things again, he wouldn't feel them the same way. He asked which 3 fingers. She told him. He looked at his hands. They were wrapped in regenerative mesh that glowed faintly blue, and underneath the mesh, the skin was still raw and new and tender, in a way that made ordinary air feel like sandpaper. He flexed them. The motion was clumsy. His ring finger on the left didn't respond at all. Could have been worse, he said. So-yi didn't agree. She also didn't argue. She made a note on her datapad and moved to the next bed, where Jihwan was sleeping with his ribs wrapped, and his breathing slow and even and machine-assisted, in a way that she was not going to think about right now. On Tiraneth, the crystal halls were being repaired. Velith engineers moved through the damaged sections with the quiet efficiency of a species that expressed grief through restoration. If the walls were whole, the wound hadn't happened. Cracks were filled. Surfaces were polished. The record of what had almost destroyed the station was being erased 1 panel at a time. The Concord convened 3 days after the array activation. Full assembly, every species represented. The chamber was the same one where Taesung had argued for reclassification and been read the same line he'd been read for 11 years. The same crystal walls, the same carved records. The same vast, spherical indifference of a room built by beings who measured history and geological time and considered individual lifespans a rounding error. Taesung entered alone. No datapad, no notes, no prepared text. He wore the same suit he'd worn to every session, sole-tailored, pressed that morning, creases in exactly the right places. He walked to the central platform with the same measured stride he'd used for 20 years. Close enough to seem cooperative, far enough to not seem eager. But before he spoke, Yoon Nari stepped forward. She had requested 2 minutes. The Concorde, operating under the emergency ratification that Taesung had negotiated, could not refuse. She stood at the secondary podium, the one designated for support staff, for translators, for species whose remarks were not considered primary, and she opened a file. She didn't editorialize. She didn't frame. She didn't build an argument. Age 26. Cause: pressure seal failure. Corridor 9. Outpost Galan. Report designation: livestock attrition, within acceptable parameters. Kim Yuna. Age 31. Cause: atmospheric toxicity exposure. Mining platform risk. Report designation: Class 9 labor loss. Logged: no action required. Lee Dongwon. Age 44. Cause: structural collapse during Velith supervised construction. Report designation: equipment damage. Unit non-recoverable. She read 47 names, 47 reports, dates, causes, designations, each one a human life, compressed into a line of bureaucratic text by a system that did not have a category for what those lives meant. She read them the way a person reads a list of names at a memorial. Not to argue, not to accuse, but to make the room hold each one for a moment before moving to the next. To make the silence between names do the work that no speech could. The Drumi delegation began to weep 18 names in. Their empathic network, which turned emotion into a shared biological experience, carried the weight of every entry across every droomy in the chamber. They wept, not because they chose to, but because their bodies couldn't do anything else when confronted with that much grief compressed into that little space. Nari finished. She closed the file. She stepped back. Taesung took the platform. He looked at the Pelori, who had manifested physically for only the second time in centuries. He looked at the Velith, who built everything and felt nothing they didn't carve. He looked at the Drumi, still trembling. He looked at the Ohar, floating in their mobile tanks, running calculations on what they'd just heard, because numbers were the only language they had for things that hurt. He didn't argue for reclassification. He didn't plead. He didn't list achievements, or cite data, or present the case he'd spent 20 years building. He told them what Class 9 meant. "You classified us by what we endure," he said. "You were not wrong. We endure. That is what we do. We endure cold and heat and vacuum and radiation and grief and cruelty and indifference. And we keep walking because something in us, something older than language, older than tools, older than fire, refuses to agree that the world gets the last word." His voice was steady, not loud. Taesung had never needed volume. He had always understood that the quietest voice, in a room full of shouting, is the one people lean in to hear. "You measured this," he said. "You put it in your files and called it tolerance, pain tolerance, environmental tolerance. You looked at a species that survived ice ages and plagues and its own worst impulses, and you said they tolerate well. Put them in the mines. It is not tolerance. It is refusal. We do not tolerate pain. We refuse to let it be the end of the story. You gave us the worst jobs, the worst stations, the worst designation your system allows, and we did not break. Not because we are strong, because we are stubborn. Because somewhere between the first human who picked up a rock and the last one who walked into your black wave, we decided that giving up was not available. It was removed from the list. It is not something we do." The chamber was silent. Not the polite silence of a bureaucracy waiting for its turn. The real kind. The kind that means something has landed in a room and nobody knows how to pick it up. The Pelori spoke. Their voice filled the chamber, and for the first time since the classification system's creation, it carried something other than procedure. It carried weight. They did not reclassify humanity. Reclassification was a correction. This was not a correction. They created a new designation. The first new classification in the system's history. A category that had never existed because no species had ever required it. Class 0. Foundational species. Defining trait. Persistence beyond rational threshold. Status. Sovereign. The chamber erupted. Not in applause. The Concord didn't do applause. In movement. In murmur. In the particular kind of chaos that happens when a system that has been running the same way for millennia is told it has a new variable. Taesung stood on the platform. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He looked at the carved records on the walls, the billions of entries, each species reduced to a single line. And he knew that somewhere on that wall, a new line was being written. He thought about the 47 names Nari had read. He thought about the ones she hadn't, the ones from before his time, from the early labor contracts, from the first human crews sent to Velith stations who never came home, and whose reports were filed under categories that didn't include the word person. The celebration, such as it was muted. On the Sejong, the crew watched the broadcast. Some cheered, some sat quiet. Jisik watched from the tactical room, with his arms crossed, and his face carrying the expression of a man who was glad to be wrong about something for once, and was not sure how to wear that feeling. In the medical bay, Do-hyun watched on a screen mounted to the ceiling above his bed. Soi sat in the chair beside him. She had been there for 3 hours. She had not spoken for most of them. Nari had insisted that a memorial feed run alongside the ceremony broadcast the names of every human who had died under Concord classification, scrolling in a slow, steady column on every screen on Tyraneth. The names moved at a pace that let you read each one if you tried, but there were so many that trying meant you would still be reading long after the ceremony ended. Do-hyun watched the names scroll. He didn't read all of them. He read one. Park Woo-jin. He looked at his hands, open, scarred. The regenerative mesh was off now, and the skin underneath was pink and tight and new. His ring finger still didn't move right. The nerves in his right palm sent signals that his brain translated as static. Not pain, not numbness, but a low hum that he suspected would never fully stop. He opened his hands wider, spread the fingers, felt the pull of new skin against old damage. Soy didn't say anything. She just sat there. That was enough. Outside the Sejong's viewport, Tyraneth turned slowly against the dark. Its crystal walls caught starlight and scattered it into 1,000 fractured colors, and the cracks from the black wave were still visible if you knew where to look. Thin lines running through the surface like veins, like history, like the kind of damage that doesn't disappear when you polish over it. The galaxy had a new word for what humans were. It was carved into crystal now, official and permanent, and ratified by beings older than most stars. Class 0. Foundational. But Do-hyun didn't think about classifications. He thought about Woo-jin, who played cards badly. He thought about the corridor on Gallon where the seal broke. He thought about the weight of a Druumi elder on his back, and the sound of crystal walls singing as they cracked, and the way Soi's voice sounded when she said okay, 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 like a prayer to a god made entirely of stubbornness. He closed his eyes.